Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I'm probably going to just spend a little bit of time. It might not be a huge video, but I just want to talk about one topic because it's a really interesting philosophical topic, and some of you may be like, oh god, philosophy, whatever. But I think it's important to get a grounding in rational justification for the opinions we have. Now, I talked about a tear gas being used by the Russians against the Ukrainians and saying that it's against conventions and whatnot, and just not only just about tear gas, which might not be the worst of the chemical weapons that can be used, but just in chemical weapons in general. I was talking about how actually it's philosophically not very tenable to draw these demarcations between what is an acceptable weapon and what isn't an acceptable weapon. It's like we can have nuclear weapons, right? And they're not illegal, but we can't use CS gas, right? We can have thermobaric munitions that are just horrific, yet you can't use CS gas. So there's something weird going on there. And I just want to share with you a bunch of comments that were said to me in the thread from this morning. And I think some people kind of didn't quite get it or were jumping on me from an intuitive point of view. And I think a number of the comments I don't think were correct. And I just want to inspire you guys to have an interesting conversation about, I mean, it's a horrible subject, right? And what I'm not saying is that the chemical weapons are cool and good and fine and whatever. It's just terrible. But it's just what I'm trying to say is that trying to draw a line between one type of terrible and another type of terrible is a bit more difficult than you might think, because what you're doing, what a lot of us are doing, are having intuitions that are actually based on received kind of wisdom, right? And we grow up hearing that chemical weapons are horrible, but not really thinking the same about other types of weapons that can rip your legs off and leave you maimed for life or dead, like not existing. What's worse, having like lung condition for the rest of your life, or being dead because your head's been blown off? Like, it's a horrible kind of either or there, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. I just want to go to these comments first, and then I'm going to go to an article, and we can discuss it afterwards. So this person, the reason they ban tear gas is because it is used to kill. And by the way, all of these points are highly questionable, and we will question them. So the reason it's banned is because it's used to kill. So we'll disagree with that in a bit. You are not thinking like a person looking to kill as many as one group as possible. Again, this is actually like demonstrably wrong. If you stay in tear gas for too long, it will eventually do irreparable damage, and it's going to be excruciating as it does. Not disputing that. So troops will leave their position. That's the point. It's to make it easier to blow their heads off. Makes it easier to rip more limbs than with a single mortar. It makes troops much more helpless and unable to defend themselves, or even to be able to find cover. Hell, it can make them so disorientated they can't even surrender. Which you can do in other ways. You can make people leave their trenches. You can scare them to leave their trenches and do the same. So is it illegal to scare people? Do you know what I mean? But anyway, those assumptions at the beginning are highly questionable. We'll look at them later. The usage of tear gas as chemical weapon is forbidden for a reason. The background is that tear gas is a mask breaker, and you can, after the enemy had to take his mask off, deploy a pulmonary agent like chlorine or phosgene to finish him off completely, according to the Bruckmüller doctrine of Berntschiessen, the use of different chemical agents in a specific order to cause maximum destruction. The German army in the Great War used different coloured crosses on their chemical grenades to identify the agent. That's what Paddy Pliner says, so thanks, Paddy, although I'm going to disagree with that as well. Peter Gerdes here has it right. Of course, the distinction between tear gas and other weapons is arbitrary, but that's the nature of rules and agreements. That is actually the most accurate thing that someone said, and we're going to get onto that in a little bit. You need to know your philosophy in order to be able to rationally justify what he says, but that's correct. A bit mystified by your comments about tear gas. Yes, it's non-lethal, but hang on, someone's just said it is lethal, and that's the problem. And now we've got someone saying it's not, and I'm wrong for both counts. So, I'm not having a go at what people are saying, but I find this interesting and I want to get to the bottom of it. A bit mystified by your comments about tear gas. Yes, it's non-lethal. No, that's not the issue why they're banned. The reason for the ban is a possibility of rapid and deadly escalation. So we now had 3 reasons they're banned, and all of them are different from each other. And everyone's very, very certain about this. So the background is that, what is he saying? No, that's not the issue. Why they're banned. The reason is the possibility of rapid and deadly escalation. Today, tear gas, tomorrow, mustard gas, chlorine gas, etc. The effects during World War I were so horrifying that not even Germany in World War II used it at the front, chemical weapons. And actually, I'm going to call that into question. Chemical weapons are seen by some as a stepping stone to nuclear weapons. No idea if the latter is correct, but still. And then someone's saying the point about banning tear gas is this: if any chemical weapons are allowed, then Pandora's box is opened. It's slightly similar to the last one. It's an escalation thing. Tear gas will start having more and more damaging components until it finally becomes a lethal agent. What? And like a bullet isn't a lethal agent? Like a mortar isn't? Like a Kinjal missile? Like a nuclear missile? At that point, the international consensus against chemical weapons becomes defunct and all kinds of horrors will emerge. It surprises me that Jonathan fails to grasp that. I grasp that, but it's just wrong. It's literally not why they're banned. And again, you can apply that to conventional weapons. The problem is that most of these arguments against chemical weapons can be applied to conventional weapons. Like, conventional weapons can do horrific things. A thermobaric munition, which vaporizes you and sucks out the oxygen and burns you to death, is absolutely horrific way to die. And it's arguably no more or less horrific than chemical weapons. Yet one is legal and the other isn't. We're going to come on to the finer details. In fact, we'll probably do that now. There is lots more to add to that. Loads more comments about that. And thank you for commenting. I'm not. Please comment. Please have these opinions, even if we disagree. Let's try and investigate these so we can come to some kind of understanding, hopefully that's mutually beneficial. Right, let's look at this Politico article, which I think is a good place to investigate this. Why the world banned chemical weapons? Yes, it's because they're morally hideous. But the point I would make is they're no more morally hideous than conventional weapons. But it's also because they didn't work. They don't work. That's the key, actually, that this article really makes. It doesn't really go into the fact they're morally hideous, particularly. And that, compared to conventional weapons, they are no more or less morally hideous, would be my point. And we'll look at that a little bit later. Right. One answer, so the question is, why are they banned? One answer is that while gas attacks are terrifying, the weapon has proved to be militarily ineffective. This is the absolute key, and I don't think people know this, right? So this is why we're going to investigate this. After Ypres, where it was used in the First World War, the Allies provided masks to their frontline troops who stood in their trenches killing on-rushing Germans as clouds of gas enveloped their legs. In other words, it didn't work very well to take out the Allied troops because they could wear gas masks and still kill the Germans who were attacking. That was true even as both sides climbed the escalatory ladder, introducing increasingly lethal chemicals, phosgene and mustard gas, as mentioned earlier, that were then matched by increasingly effective countermeasures. The weapon also proved difficult to control. Several well-documented instances, gases deployed by frontline troops blew back into their own trenches, giving a literalist tinge to the term blowback, now used to describe the unintended consequences of an intelligence operation. Okay, so it goes on and to talk about it in the First World War context. Now, after the war, the great powers agreed that the use of poison gas was wrong, but it's no more wrong than conventional weapons, right? The justification that it's wrong, all the justifications that chemical weapons are wrong are generally equally applicable to conventional weapons. Like, one type of horror is indistinguishable really from another type of horror or terrible death. Or you could even argue that being alive, so I'm going to do a sidebar here. So being alive but with a terrible lung condition that might be excruciatingly painful, but is that better or worse than having my head blown off by a mortar, right? Or is it better or worse than having all my limbs removed but being alive? Would I prefer to have a lung disease, issue for the rest of my life, or no limbs? I would go for the lung issue. I'd prefer to be the recipient of that chemical attack as opposed to that like mortar attack that's blown all my limbs off. It's really difficult to say one is worse than another. They're both horrible. And in fact, if you have a terrible like lung issue that gives you excruciating pain, at least you can then decide to take your own life. Like moral issues of suicide aside, I have control over my outcome. Whereas if I'm killed outright by a hand grenade blowing my head off, I'm dead outright. I didn't get that choice. So what's worse? So you can have really interesting, and it's morbid and horrible, but actually really interesting philosophical discussions about these different situations. But the key is here. After the Great War, the great powers agreed that use of poison gas was wrong, okay, but didn't banish it outright. Why not? In 1925, the Geneva Protocol prohibited the, quote, use in war of asphyxiating poisonous or other gases and of bacteriological methods of warfare. The agreement was signed most prominently by those who had used gas in the Great War: Austria, Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. The US signed the protocol, but the Senate did not ratify it until 1975. Worth noting. The protocol was widely hailed as recognition by the international community that some weapons were too horrible to use even in war, which I think is just demonstrably problematic. As if, again, it goes back to that point, that horror is like nuclear weapon killing people and radiating the area. Is that better or worse? Or just like firebombing Tokyo? As if that's not too horrible to use. It's just all disgusting. But manifestly, the treaty did not ban the production or stockpiling of gas or chemical weapons as a kind of unstated just-in-case clause, and most of the major signatories to the agreement continued to develop increasingly lethal poison gas weapons. Now, nor, as it turns out, did the stigma attached to the use of gas prohibit its use in the conflicts that followed. There were widespread reports that the British used gas against the Kurds in the 1920 uprising in Iraq. While the reports remain unconfirmed, the War Secretary at the time, Winston Churchill, favoured it. Quote, "I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of gas," he said. "I'm strongly in favour of using poisoned gas against uncivilised tribes." Right. We'll ignore the outright racism there that unfortunately Winston Churchill is known for. If you see his views on India and the famine there and everything to do with that, then you would understand. But Benito Mussolini agreed. In late 1935, he approved the use of mustard gas by the Italian army during its invasion of Ethiopia. The attacks that followed resulted in more than 100,000 casualties. The unstated just-in-case clause was also quietly prominent during World War II. In 1944, Churchill, by then Prime Minister, urged his military commanders to think very seriously over the question of poison gas. "It is absurd," Churchill went on to say, "to consider morality on this topic when everybody used it in the last war without a word of complaint from the moralists or the church." And Churchill went further, saying the only reason the Germans hadn't used poison gas against Allied troops was because they feared retaliation. So if we go back to the Germans didn't use it because it was so, even they didn't use it because it was so horrific, is, as far as I can work out, ostensibly incorrect, right? And there are still questions as to why the Germans didn't use chemical weapons in World War II. But the most plausible, as it says here, the more plausible explanation is that Hitler and his commanders understood that the weapons had battlefield limitations. In other words, they just weren't good enough. Like, if you've got someone that's happy to gas like millions of people in gas chambers, yet not use it in the battlefield, then it's not a moral issue here. There's no moral component to that. It's that, like, Hitler didn't use it because, do you know what, that's terrible. Oh, by the way, yeah, turn on those showers. That ain't what happened. So the guy's prepared to do terrible things. He didn't use them, I would say, most plausibly, because actually they're not very effective. And that's why they ended up getting banned, as we're going to find out. I mean, this is super important. So whatever was really behind Hitler's reluctance, it confirms what advocates for the banning of certain classes of weapons have suspected for years, that the world's militaries are loath to ban weapons that kill effectively, while acceding to bans of weapons that they don't need. This explains so much. This also explains why all the major warring nations of the world haven't signed up to the cluster munitions conventions. Right, you might see that, was it 170 nations or whatever it is have signed up to that, and this is all the controversy over the cluster munitions and landmines and whatnot. But of those nations, how many have the biggest armies? In fact, when you do a population analysis of the countries that haven't signed up to it. 8 out of the 10 most populous nations in the world have not signed up to it, and all the major warring nations have not signed up to it. In other words, they're horrible weapons, yes, but they're really damn defective. That's why we're still using them, and that's why you're seeing them in Ukraine. Ukraine wanted cluster munitions because they were the most effective munitions to use, and we've had these arguments, right? Chemical weapons are not actually very effective, which the argument is why they were banned, because they could be banned. So anyway, moving on. Quote, and this is from retired Army Colonel Paul Hughes, served as a senior staff officer at the Pentagon's Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, says, "It is a fickle weapon that can be turned on the attacker, so it was easy to negotiate its ban because it wasn't as effective as conventional artillery." But Hughes disagrees with the notion that the military will agree to ban only a weapon that is ineffective, pointing out the US military eliminated all of its nuclear artillery rounds and its family of nuclear-capable intermediate-range missiles, even though both would have been useful in a fight with the USSR. There's some grey areas. Now, even so, the US military dug in its heels on 2 weapon systems that have been the focus of international efforts to ban them. In the mid-1990s, the military opposed a ban on landmines, despite strong support for outlawing them among a powerful group of retired senior military officers and a coalition of US non-governmental organizations. The issue then was whether US smart mines, which turned themselves off after a prescribed period, could be removed from the US arsenal, and whether the American army needed mines in South Korea where they are stockpiled for use against an invasion by North Korea. Additionally, key senior military officers believed agreeing to the ban would set a dangerous precedent that the military could be pressured into banning weapons by what they described as left-leaning humanitarian organizations. You have the sliding issue in reverse here. So when does, you can go forward and say, right, we're going to ban that because it's terrible, but then do you keep taking it back and saying, well, that's terrible, and eventually you ban like knives? Like, where do you draw the line again as to what is terrible and what isn't? The view was reflected in a legendary exchange between then Army Chief of Staff Eric Shinseki, who lost a foot on a landmine in Vietnam, and Senator Patrick Leahy, who led the ban effort. Their exchange took place during a meeting on Capitol Hill. Quote, "We don't want them and we don't need them," Shinseki said, "and we're not going to get rid of them." And he had lost his foot to one, right? The US had also resisted efforts to ban cluster munitions, bombs that contain vicious bomblets that spread over a wide area. Cluster munitions were widely used during the Clinton administration's war in the Balkans, but left the battlefield littered with bomblets that failed to explode and so continued to kill and maim long after the war was concluded. The ban efforts began with a meeting of international delegates in Switzerland in the late 1990s, during which a coalition of delegates argued for and against the ban. Among the ban supporters was a Norwegian foreign ministry official who issued an impassioned plea for the adoption of a treaty banning the weapon. And this is just a great quote coming up. In the midst of his talk, which I attended, says the author of this piece, a British colonel leaned across the table at which I was sitting, a wry smile on his face. "You know why the Norwegians favour a ban?" he asked. I shook my head. No. Because they don't have any. That's the point. Like, they're ineffective, we don't have any, so it's easy to ban them. There are 2 arguments. We don't have any, we don't use them, so let's ban them. But also, they're just not very good, so it's easy for us to ban something. I'm splicing 2 things together here, which are different. One is the idea of the cluster munitions, where the Norwegians say we don't have any, so therefore we can ban them. And the other idea is that Americans will be up, or other nations have been up for banning chemical weapons, but only because they're ineffective rather than they're just like morally wrong. So you got 2 things going on there. Anyway, the British colonel had it just right. The world's militaries don't want to ban weapons that are efficient killers. So while it is true that the landmine and cluster munitions banned have gained widespread international support, 162 countries have signed the landmine ban, 108 countries have signed into the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The countries most likely to use both, the US, China, Russia, and India, remain non-signatories. In the parlance of those working on these bans, the weapons have not yet been fully stigmatized. It's about the stigma of the weapons rather than any actual real justifications. It's an intuitive stigma, and I think that's really important. It goes on to talk about that not being the same with poison gas, which still has that stigma, doesn't it, about spreading terror. But terror they are, they do spread terror. Like poison gas gives you that intuitive terror, but terror doesn't rip your legs off, right? You can't ban something on just terror, and yet keep something that's going to blow your legs off. Just absolutely. Yeah, I think it's fraught with issue, these kind of arguments. Anyway, we're going to look at the Socrates paradox again just briefly. Socrates paradox is my favourite thought experiment in philosophy, and you can apply it to anything that exists on a continuum. And it's the problem with demarcating a continuum. So the paradox is that you start with a grain of sand, or a sand dune, or a moustache, a beard. It's sometimes called the theory of the beard, right? You pluck a hair out. When does your beard become not a beard? So you have a sand dune, you take a grain of sand off, is that still a sand dune? Everyone goes, well, yeah. You keep doing that, and no point does anyone agree when it goes from being a sand dune to not being a sand dune. So the paradox is you end up getting to one grain of sand and it's still a sand dune, and you take the grain of sand away and you still not got that demarcation, and you got 0 grains of sand, and 0 grains of sand is still a sand dune. Okay, so in other words, there's a fuzzy logic. You can see the difference between this part of the continuum and this part of the continuum, but you can't draw that line accurately anyway because it's fairly arbitrary. I've given a talk on this in terms of personhood, like the philosophy of personhood, and you can apply the Socrates paradox to all sorts of things. Evolution, right? One species going to another species over time. If we come on here, we can look at this in terms of, where do we go? How do I move on? So here we go. So if we have the kind of tree of life here type thing, as far as evolution is concerned, right? You look on a continuum of one species evolving through to another species, or you have this cutoff point where you say, well, this is the species before, and this is the species it becomes. Where does it go from one species to the other? When you've got incremental changes all along that continuum. And of course, there is no point. Like Homo australopithecus didn't give birth to a Homo heidelbergensis, right? Not saying that that's one that comes after the other, but you get the point. It's not like you give birth to this new species and go, oh look what we've done. Isn't that amazing? We did that. We just gave birth to a new species. Those changes happen over time, and we draw a line down arbitrarily, but it could be over there, it could be over there. There's no right or wrong. What we do is we try and compartmentalize or categorize things to aid us in our thinking. But those categories are kind of false. It's like adulthood's the same. In Britain, it's 18 for voting, 16 for consensual sex. It's 18 for drinking. But in other countries, that's different. In America, it changes from state to state of when you can drink. Those arbitrary lines of like when you're responsible enough, when you're adult enough, change over time and place. And there's no kind of objective truth. We just kind of agree by kind of consensus. Now, when it comes to like what's bad enough to justify banning, it's like, well, that's an arbitrary line. But also, there are many kind of branches to the line. It's not like horrific to not horrific. You got horrific, like I've said, horrific in terms of losing limbs compared to horrific in terms of like breathing issues. Like where do we draw the line of what's horrible enough to ban? It's just really problematic. And some people might say, draw the line there. Other people might draw the line there. And other people might say, it's arbitrary to even have a line. These are all horrific things. Like, you either have war, where your intention is to try and kill as many of the other people as possible so that they give up and let you do what you want, or you ban everything. Like if you're going to have war, people it's so weird to say, we're going to have war, but we're going to like have all of these rules around war. So you can kill people, but you can only kill them in certain ways. Blowing their heads off is fine. Like, you can get rid of all their limbs. That's fine. You can give them excruciating pain for life. It's fine, as long as it's not done by chemical. You can do that by physical stuff, not chemical stuff. Chemical is no. But actually, if you have an explosion right on their face, you can maim them. They can be on life support and excruciating pain, but that's fine. That's fine because we did it with a conventional weapon. But you're not allowed to do anything that has the same effect, but with a chemical weapon. And you're like, oh my goodness, how are we differentiating this? But on the other hand, like, it's intuitively horrible to think of gas clouds. But why is gas cloud any worse than a thermobaric munition range where you're getting vaporized with heat? Like, we allow that, and that's freaking horrible. But we don't allow that, and that's my point. So people are calling me out, but I don't think they've done really enough thinking about this. I mean, not all of them. There are just lots of differing views on why chemical weapons are being banned, which I think is interesting of itself, because I think no one's actually therefore clear about why they're banned. There's maybe a lack of understanding of the history of why they got to be banned, and the argument is they actually were banned because it was easy to ban something that was pretty horrible, but no more horrible as something else, but made you sound moral, because actually we don't really need them because they're not good enough. They're not effective enough weapons. It's just, there's questions about why Assad used chemical weapons, because actually they're just, what are you trying to do? So yeah, it's great for, effective for causing terror. And if you want to cause terror, then yeah. But, I still think using thermobaric munitions will cause pretty similar terror. And I don't know. I think it's all kind of a bit of an arbitrary, a game of arbitrary delineations and demarcations. And that I don't think are necessarily as justified as one might think. So, when it comes to the philosophy here, I'm on the side that you can't easily demarcate these ideas on the continuum. When do you become an infant, a child? When do you become an adolescent, an adult? When do you become a geriatric? At what stage is it? When does that text go from being red to being blue? Is there a particular point on there? When do we go from something that's too horrific, from not horrific enough to too horrific for war, where the point of war, or one of the main methods of war, is causing the death of other people? I mean, is there anything more horrific than making someone cease to exist? Making large numbers of people cease to exist? A really big bomb? Like, why is it that Putin can use a Kinzhal hypersonic missile to go and hit a residential block or something like that, or an anti-ship missile, and people are like, oh, that's horrible, I wish he'd stop doing that, we are really angry about that. But it's like, if he'd used a chemical weapon in that city, it would have been a red line. No, hang on, I think that's a red line. Do you know what I mean? We have these kind of false distinctions. Anyway, I'm liable to go off on one. Chemical weapons are freaking disgusting and horrific. Conventional weapons can be freaking disgusting and horrific. Is there a meaningful difference between the two? Or are chemical weapons banned for other reasons under the guise of being banned for moral reasons? If they had been truly effective, would we have seen them be used far more widely in the Second World War than they were? And is it a case that it's actually the ineffectiveness of the weapons that allowed them to be banned and allowed for more support to be garnered in banning them? Open discussion, guys. As I always say, question everything, particularly ourselves and our own intuitions. Remember, I am not in any way justifying the use of chemical weapons necessarily. I'm questioning. I mean, all weapons are horrible. Are we creating false distinctions? Over to you.